In the autumn of 1888, London was the heart of the British Empire. It was one of the largest and most powerful cities in the world, filled with grand buildings, busy markets, wealthy businessmen, horse-drawn carriages, factories, theaters, and thousands of people arriving every day in search of work. But beneath the impressive image of Victorian London was another city, a city of poverty, overcrowded streets, dirty alleyways, disease, crime, and desperate people struggling simply to survive. One of the darkest areas of London was Whitechapel, located in the East End. Whitechapel was crowded with working-class families, immigrants, sailors, laborers, street vendors, and people living in extremely poor conditions. Many homes were overcrowded. Some families shared tiny rooms. Sanitation was poor, and disease spread easily. At night, the narrow streets could become dangerous. Gas lamps provided limited light, leaving many alleys almost completely dark. For people who had nowhere else to go, the streets became their home. Among the poorest residents were women who survived through prostitution. For some, it was not a choice, but a desperate way to earn enough money for food, shelter, or alcohol. These women often lived from one day to the next. They were vulnerable. They frequently worked alone at night, and many disappeared without attracting much attention from the authorities. Then, in the second half of 1888, something terrifying began to happen. Women were being murdered in and around Whitechapel. The killings were brutal. The victims were discovered in dark streets, courtyards, and other isolated locations. At first, police did not know whether the murders were connected. London was a huge city. Violent crime was not unusual. But the nature of these killings gradually convinced investigators that something much more disturbing was happening. A killer appeared to be targeting vulnerable women, and whoever he was, he seemed to understand how to operate in the darkness of London's streets. The true beginning of the Jack the Ripper story is generally associated with another woman. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. Mary was known as Polly Nichols. She was born in London in 1845 and experienced many difficulties throughout her life. By 1888, she was living in poverty and sometimes worked as a prostitute. On the night of August 30th, 1888, Nichols was seen alive in Whitechapel. She needed money for a place to sleep. Like many vulnerable women in the area, she was exposed to enormous risks while working alone at night. In the early morning of August 31st, a man named Charles Cross was walking to work along Bucks Row. The street was quiet. The city was beginning to wake. Then, Cross saw something lying on the ground. At first, he believed it might be a person who had fallen asleep. He approached. It was Mary Ann Nichols. She was dead. A second man, Robert Paul, soon joined him. The two men alerted the authorities. Police arrived and began examining the scene. Nichols had suffered severe injuries. Her throat had been cut. There were also abdominal injuries. Investigators immediately began asking questions. Who had been with her? Where had she gone before the attack? Had anyone seen a suspicious man? Had anyone heard anything? But the streets of Whitechapel provided few answers. There were no modern surveillance cameras, no DNA testing, no computerized databases, no reliable forensic technology. Investigators depended almost entirely on eyewitnesses, physical clues, and questioning local residents. In a crowded neighborhood where people came and went constantly, identifying a killer was difficult. The murder of Mary Ann Nichols created fear in Whitechapel, but the nightmare was only beginning. Less than a week later, Another woman was murdered. Her name was Annie Chapman. Chapman was born in 1841 and had experienced poverty and personal tragedy. By 1888, she was living in the Spitalfields area and struggling financially. On the morning of September 8th, her body was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. The scene was horrifying. Like Nichols, Chapman had suffered a fatal throat injury. But investigators also found evidence suggesting that the killer had carried out further mutilation. The brutality was shocking, even by the standards of Victorian London. Police began to suspect that the two murders might be connected. The same general area, similar victim profiles, similar injuries, a similar method of attack. Fear spread through Whitechapel. People began looking over their shoulders at night. Women were afraid to walk alone. Shopkeepers closed earlier. Residents discussed the murders in pubs, markets, and homes. Newspapers began reporting the killings with increasing intensity. The story was no longer limited to Whitechapel. London wanted answers. Who was killing these women? Why were they being targeted? And how could someone murder them and disappear into the city's darkness? The police launched investigations. Detectives questioned witnesses. They searched buildings. They examined the crime scenes. They investigated suspicious individuals. But there was a fundamental problem. The killer chose his victims and locations carefully. The murders happened at night. The streets were poorly lit. Witnesses often saw only brief shadows or vague figures. Descriptions of suspicious men varied. Some witnesses reported seeing a man wearing dark clothing. Others described a shorter or taller figure. Some mentioned a hat. Others remembered a coat. Nothing was reliable enough to identify a suspect. Then, on September 30th, 1888, London was shaken by two more murders. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride. Stride was a Swedish-born woman who lived in the East End. Her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard near Berner Street. Unlike the murders of Nichols and Chapman, Stride's body did not show extensive mutilation. Her throat had been cut, but the killer may have been interrupted before he could do more. Some historians believe this may explain why another victim was killed later that same night. That second victim was Catherine Eddowes. Eddowes had spent much of her life struggling with poverty. On the night of September 29th, she had been arrested for drunkenness and taken into custody. She was released shortly after midnight. Less than an hour later, her body was discovered in Mitre Square, inside the City of London. The injuries were horrific. Her throat had been cut, and her body had been severely mutilated. The murder immediately became one of the most disturbing crimes London had ever seen. Two women had been killed within a very short period. The police now had a terrifying possibility to consider. They might be dealing with a single serial killer. The newspapers quickly connected the murders. Public fear exploded. People demanded that the killer be caught. And then something appeared that would help create one of the most famous criminal legends in history. A letter was sent to a news agency. It was signed Jack the Ripper. The writer claimed responsibility for the murders. The letter was written in a threatening and mocking style. Whether the letter was genuine remains highly disputed, but the name became famous, Jack the Ripper. It was short, memorable, terrifying, and soon newspapers across Britain were using it. The unknown killer now had an identity, even though nobody knew his real name. More letters followed. One of the most famous was the so-called From Hell letter, which was sent to George Lusk, head of a local vigilante committee. It arrived with part of a human kidney. The sender claimed it came from one of the victims. The authenticity of the letter and kidney has never been conclusively established, but the story created enormous public fascination. The newspapers printed sensational reports. Rumors spread through London. People accused strangers. Immigrants were blamed for the murders. Foreigners were targeted by suspicion. Anyone behaving strangely could become a suspect. The police were under enormous pressure. Thousands of people lived in Whitechapel, and detectives had to investigate an enormous number of possibilities. But modern criminal investigation barely existed. Fingerprinting was not yet routinely used. DNA science was decades away. Forensic pathology was still developing. Police communication was limited, and crime scenes could easily become contaminated by crowds. The police also faced another challenge. There were multiple independent police forces operating in London. The Metropolitan Police investigated most of Whitechapel, but the City of London Police controlled the area where Catherine Eddowes was killed. Coordination was not always easy. The killer benefited from the confusion. After the murders of Stride and Eddowes, the public became convinced that something extraordinary was happening. But the story was far from over. On November 9, 1888, another woman named Mary Jane Kelly was murdered in her small room at 13 Miller's Court. Her death was particularly horrific. Unlike the previous victims, Kelly was killed indoors. The condition of her body made the crime scene one of the most disturbing in the entire investigation. She became the final and most commonly accepted member of the group known as the Canonical Five. These 5 women are generally identified as Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. However, the question remains controversial. Were these 5 women definitely killed by the same person? Historians cannot prove it with absolute certainty. Other murders occurred in the same area and period. Some researchers believe additional victims may have been connected. Others argue that the killer's pattern changed too dramatically between certain cases. The mystery became even deeper because the murders suddenly stopped. After Mary Jane Kelly's death, there were no further killings universally accepted as the work of Jack the Ripper. The killer seemed to disappear. No arrest, no confirmed identity, no confession, no final explanation. Just silence. For the police, it was a devastating failure. For the newspapers, it became an irresistible mystery. For historians, it became one of the most famous unsolved criminal cases in history. But who was Jack the Ripper? Was he a local man, a doctor, a butcher, a sailor, an immigrant, a wealthy gentleman, a criminal already known to police? Or was the entire image of Jack the Ripper partly created by newspapers and public imagination? More than a century later, investigators continue to debate the possibilities. Hundreds of suspects have been proposed. Some were serious suspects, others were almost certainly innocent. And modern researchers have used everything from historical documents to forensic science. The murders in Whitechapel had already terrified London, but after the deaths of Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, the investigation entered an entirely new phase. The police were under enormous pressure. The public wanted an arrest. Newspapers demanded answers, and detectives were searching through one of the most crowded and difficult neighborhoods in London. But the biggest problem remained the same. Nobody knew who the killer was. There was no photograph, no reliable fingerprint, no DNA, no modern surveillance. The police had only fragments of information. A witness might remember seeing a suspicious man for a few seconds. Another person might describe a different-looking individual. Some witnesses were afraid to speak. Others may have misunderstood what they had seen. And in a neighborhood filled with thousands of people, a man could disappear into the crowd within seconds. The investigation soon produced a long list of suspects. One of the most famous was Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a young barrister and teacher from a respectable family. He had no known history that clearly connected him to the murders. But shortly after the final canonical murder, Druitt disappeared and was later found dead in the River Thames. His death made him a compelling suspect to later writers. Some believed that his death explained why the murders suddenly stopped. But there was no direct evidence proving that Druitt was Jack the Ripper. Another famous suspect was Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant living in the Whitechapel area. He worked as a barber and had a history of mental illness. Police records indicate that he became a suspect during the investigation. However, he was never formally convicted or charged with the murders. His name became more important many years later when researchers attempted to connect him to forensic evidence. One of the most famous claims involved a shawl allegedly associated with Catherine Eddowes. Some researchers claimed that DNA found on the fabric connected Kosminski to the crime. But the evidence has been heavily disputed. Questions have been raised about the shawl's history, contamination, and the reliability of the genetic testing. Therefore, the DNA claim has not been accepted as definitive proof that Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. Another suspect was Francis Tumblety, an American-born man with a controversial reputation. Tumblety was arrested in London around the time of the murders, although the charges against him were unrelated to the killings. Eventually, he left Britain. Some later writers suggested that police may have suspected him of involvement in the murders, but again, no conclusive evidence has ever established that Tumblety was the killer. Other suspects included doctors, surgeons, criminals, aristocrats, immigrants, and ordinary workers. Some theories were based on tiny pieces of evidence. Others were based almost entirely on speculation. The enormous number of suspects demonstrates how difficult it is to solve a historical mystery. Once a crime becomes famous, investigators can begin seeing connections that may not actually exist. Every strange person becomes suspicious. Every unexplained document becomes a clue. Every unusual behavior becomes evidence. But suspicion is not proof. The police investigation also suffered from disagreements between investigators. The Metropolitan Police and City of London Police operated in different jurisdictions. The murders of Nichols, Chapman, Stride, and Kelly occurred within areas investigated by the Metropolitan Police, while Catherine Eddowes was murdered in the City of London. Communication between police forces was not as efficient as it would be today. Detectives also faced pressure from local communities. Residents of Whitechapel formed groups to protect their streets. One organization became known as the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Its members patrolled the streets and attempted to identify suspicious individuals. They also received letters claiming to be from the killer. This created another problem. The public was now receiving messages from people pretending to be the killer. The famous Dear Boss letter introduced the name Jack the Ripper to the public. Another letter, known as the Saucy Jackie postcard, appeared soon afterward. It referred to the recent murders and used language designed to frighten the public. Some newspapers published the letters. The name Jack the Ripper became internationally famous. But were the letters real? Many modern historians believe that most, if not all, were hoaxes. Newspapers had powerful incentives to publish sensational material. A letter claiming to come from the killer could dramatically increase public interest. Journalists competed to obtain the latest information. The more frightening the story became, the more people wanted to read it. This created a feedback loop. Crime created fear. Fear created newspaper sales. Newspaper stories created more fear, and the mysterious killer became larger than the actual evidence. The police also received thousands of letters from the members of the public. Some people claimed to know the killer. Others accused neighbors. Some offered theories. Others wanted publicity. The sheer volume of information made the investigation even more difficult. Meanwhile, rumors spread throughout London. Some people believed the killer was a doctor because of the apparent knowledge of anatomy shown in some of the murders. Others believed he was a butcher because of the use of knives. Some suspected a medical student. Others believed the murderer was a member of the aristocracy. There were even theories involving members of the royal family. One particularly famous theory claimed that Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, was secretly connected to the murders. According to the theory, the prince supposedly became involved with a woman in Whitechapel and then participated in a conspiracy to silence people who knew about it. This story became popular in books and films. But historians have found no reliable evidence proving that Prince Albert Victor was Jack the Ripper. In fact, documented evidence places him away from London during some of the murders. The royal conspiracy theory remains one of the most famous examples of how the Ripper legend expanded beyond the historical evidence. Another controversial theory involved a doctor named Sir William Gull. Gull was a respected physician who had connections to the royal family. Later writers claim that he secretly participated in the murders as part of a conspiracy. Again, there is no reliable historical evidence proving this. The story became popular largely because it combined murder, medicine, royalty, and conspiracy. It was exactly the kind of narrative that fascinated the public. But the real investigation was far less dramatic. It consisted mostly of detectives questioning residents, examining evidence, searching buildings, and trying to identify patterns. One of the most important challenges was the absence of modern forensic science. Today, investigators can collect DNA from tiny biological traces. They can examine fingerprints. They can analyze digital records. They can reconstruct movements using cameras and mobile phones. In 1888, almost none of these tools existed. Fingerprint identification was in its early stages. Blood analysis was primitive. Crime scenes could be disturbed by police officers, journalists, neighbors, and curious spectators. Even preserving evidence was difficult. This meant that important clues may have been lost forever. The Ripper murders also raised another difficult question. Was the killer really a highly skilled surgeon? Some newspaper reports suggested extraordinary anatomical knowledge, but modern historians have questioned this idea. The mutilations may have been caused by uncontrolled violence rather than expert medical procedures. The killer may have had some familiarity with anatomy, but there is no conclusive evidence that he was a surgeon. This matters because the surgeon theory influenced the investigation for decades. People began searching for doctors who behaved strangely. Medical professionals became suspects. But the actual killer could have had an entirely different occupation. Another possibility was that he worked in an environment where knives were common. Butchers, slaughtermen, and factory workers were among the people considered. Again, no theory has been proven. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that the killer was simply an ordinary man who blended into Whitechapel. Someone who went to work, spoke to neighbors, walked through the streets, and disappeared into the population after committing the murders. If that was the case, the police may have encountered him without realizing who he was. There was also the problem of victim selection. The women killed in the canonical 5 were vulnerable. Several were involved in prostitution, at least occasionally. They were often poor. They lived in unstable circumstances. They could disappear for hours without immediately raising an alarm. The killer may have understood this. He could approach them without attracting attention. He could promise payment. Then he could lead them into a dark location. This made the victims particularly vulnerable. The murders therefore exposed the harsh realities of Victorian poverty. Many women living in Whitechapel were struggling with homelessness, addiction, domestic violence, and unemployment. Their deaths became famous, but their lives were often forgotten. Today, historians increasingly emphasize that these women were not simply names in a murder mystery. They were mothers, daughters, wives, friends, workers, human beings with complicated lives. Their stories existed before Jack the Ripper ever entered them, and their deaths had devastating consequences for their families and communities. After Mary Jane Kelly was murdered in November 1888, the killings associated with Jack the Ripper suddenly stopped. This created one of the greatest mysteries. Why? Did the killer die? Was he arrested for another crime? Was he imprisoned? Did he leave London? Did he emigrate? Did he simply stop killing? Or were later murders actually committed by the same person? Nobody knows. The absence of further confirmed killings makes the case even more difficult. If the killer had continued for many years, police might have eventually identified a pattern. Instead, the trail disappeared. The Ripper seemed to vanish into history. Decades passed. Then new books began proposing new suspects. Each generation found new theories. Some were based on newly discovered documents. Others were based on old evidence interpreted differently. The mystery became larger with every retelling. And as the 20th century progressed, Jack the Ripper transformed from a criminal suspect into a cultural icon. His name appeared in novels, films, television programs, documentaries, museums, and historical studies. But the central question never changed. Who was Jack the Ripper? More than a century later, we still do not know. And perhaps the most frustrating part is that the killer may have left behind clues that could have solved the case, but those clues were never recognized. A witness may have seen him. A police officer may have spoken to him. A letter may have contained a genuine detail. A piece of physical evidence may still exist. But without modern technology, and without knowing exactly what investigators were looking for, the trail disappeared. The mystery, therefore, remains trapped in the streets of Victorian London, a city that has changed beyond recognition, a neighborhood that has been rebuilt, a police force that has evolved, and a killer whose real identity remains hidden. The investigation failed to produce a definitive answer, but it changed the history of criminal investigation. The Ripper case demonstrated the importance of preserving crime scenes, sharing information between police departments, protecting vulnerable communities, and developing better forensic techniques. In that sense, the darkness of Whitechapel helped push law enforcement toward the modern age. Yet, one question still remains. Was Jack the Ripper ever one person, or did the newspapers create a single terrifying character by connecting several different crimes? That question leads us into the final part of the story, where we will examine the most famous theories, modern forensic claims, the evidence surrounding the leading suspects, and why the identity of Jack the Ripper may never be known with certainty. For more than a century, the question has remained the same. Who was Jack the Ripper? The answer has never been proven. Hundreds of suspects have been suggested: doctors, butchers, workers, immigrants, criminals, members of wealthy families, and even people connected to the British royal family. But none of these theories has produced evidence strong enough to close the case. That is what makes the Jack the Ripper mystery so fascinating. The murders happened in 1888, yet the investigation continues even today. Modern researchers have examined old police records, newspaper reports, letters, photographs, maps, and surviving physical evidence. Some have even attempted to use modern DNA technology. But the further researchers look, the more complicated the mystery becomes. One of the most famous modern claims involves Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish-born immigrant who lived in Whitechapel. He was already known to police and was considered a possible suspect during the original investigation. In later years, researchers claimed that mitochondrial DNA recovered from a shawl allegedly associated with Catherine Eddowes matched DNA from descendants of Kosminski. The claim attracted worldwide attention. For a moment, it seemed that modern science might finally solve a mystery that had survived for more than 100 years. But scientists and historians quickly raised serious questions. The history of the shawl is uncertain. It is not conclusively proven that the fabric was present at Eddowes' murder scene. There is also a possibility of contamination because the object was handled by many people over the years, and mitochondrial DNA is not unique enough to identify one person with absolute certainty. Therefore, the DNA evidence does not provide definitive proof that Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. Another famous suspect was Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister and teacher from a respectable family. He died shortly after the final canonical murder. Some investigators later believed that his death might explain why the killings stopped. But there is no reliable evidence directly connecting him to the murders. The idea is based largely on circumstantial information. Then there was Francis Tumblety, an American-born man who had been living in London. He was arrested in 1888, although not for the Ripper murders. Later researchers discovered that police had some interest in him. Tumblety eventually left Britain. Some theories claim that he may have been the killer. Again, there is no conclusive evidence. Another suspect was George Chapman, a Polish-born man who later became known as a serial poisoner. He was executed for murdering his wives. Because he was a known killer, some researchers wondered whether he might also have been responsible for the Whitechapel murders, but the evidence is weak. The list continues. There were many suspects, but the same problem always appeared. Suspicion is not proof. One of the most important lessons from the Ripper case is the danger of forcing evidence to fit a theory. Once a researcher decides that someone is the killer, every unusual detail can appear significant. A strange personality becomes evidence. A missing night becomes evidence. A connection to Whitechapel becomes evidence. A medical background becomes evidence. But historical investigation requires something much stronger. It requires reliable evidence that can survive serious examination. And in the Jack the Ripper case, that evidence does not exist. Another mystery concerns the famous letters. How many were actually written by the killer? The answer may be none. The Dear Boss letter, which introduced the name Jack the Ripper, is often treated as the beginning of the legend, but many historians believe it was created by a journalist or another person seeking attention. The same possibility applies to other letters. Victorian newspapers competed aggressively for readers. A sensational letter claiming to come from a murderer could sell newspapers. This created an incentive for hoaxes. The From Hell letter is particularly famous because it was accompanied by part of a human kidney. The letter was sent to George Lusk, a member of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. But even this evidence cannot be proven to have come from the murderer. The kidney may have been irrelated. The letter may have been a cruel prank, or it may have been genuine. We simply do not know. The uncertainty is one of the defining features of the case. Another question concerns the number of victims. The 5 women most commonly associated with Jack the Ripper are known as the canonical 5. They were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. But other women were murdered in Whitechapel around the same period. Some researchers believe the Ripper may have killed more than 5 victims. Others argue that some of these murders were irrelated. This distinction is extremely important. If the same killer committed additional murders, his behavior may have been different from what historians currently understand. But if the other murders were irrelated, then the Ripper's pattern becomes narrower. The uncertainty makes it difficult to build a reliable psychological profile. Even the idea of a single Jack the Ripper may be more complicated than we imagine. It is possible that different killers were responsible for different murders. Victorian London had high levels of violence. The East End contained thousands of vulnerable people. A series of unrelated crimes could have been connected by newspapers and public fear. However, the similarities between the canonical five are strong enough that many historians still believe at least some of the murders were committed by the same person. The exact truth may never be known. What we do know is that the murders exposed the darker side of Victorian society. London was often presented as the capital of civilization. The British Empire was powerful. Industry was growing, science was advancing. But in neighborhoods like Whitechapel, thousands of people lived in poverty. Women could become vulnerable to violence because of homelessness, economic hardship, addiction, and social isolation. The Ripper murders forced the public to confront these conditions. They also changed journalism. Newspapers learned how powerful crime stories could be. Sensational headlines attracted readers. The image of a mysterious killer stalking dark London streets became a powerful cultural story. Over time, the real victims became less important than the legend. This is one of the saddest aspects of the Ripper story. Today, many people immediately recognize the name Jack the Ripper, but fewer people know much about the women he allegedly killed. Their lives were often reduced to short biographies. Their deaths became entertainment. Their names became part of a mystery. Modern historians have tried to change that perspective. The victims were not simply characters in a horror story. They were real people. Nichols had children. Annie Chapman had family. Elizabeth Stride had traveled from Sweden to England. Catherine Eddowes had experienced poverty and hardship. Mary Jane Kelly was still a young woman when she died. Each had hopes, relationships, struggles, and memories. The murders ended their lives, but their lives were much more than the circumstances of their deaths. The Ripper case also helped demonstrate the weaknesses of 19th century policing. Police officers had limited technology. Information was often stored on paper. Different departments did not always cooperate effectively. Crime scenes could be contaminated. The public could interfere with investigations, and forensic science was still developing. Today, investigators would immediately secure the crime scene. They would photograph everything, collect DNA, record fingerprints, analyze blood patterns, examine clothing, check cameras, track communications, and compare evidence with enormous databases. In 1888, detectives had none of these advantages. That is why a killer could disappear. The case also helped inspire improvements in criminal investigation. The importance of forensic evidence became increasingly recognized. Police departments developed better systems for recording information. Communication between agencies became more important. Crime scene preservation improved. Scientific methods became a central part of modern policing. In this way, the Whitechapel murders became part of the long history of modern criminal investigation. But despite technological progress, the original mystery remains. The killer's real name is unknown. His exact motive is unknown. His final fate is unknown. And even the total number of his victims is uncertain. Perhaps one day a forgotten document will be discovered. Perhaps a family archive will reveal an old confession. Perhaps future forensic technology will produce stronger evidence. But there is also another possibility. The truth may already be gone forever. The people who knew the killer personally are long dead. The original crime scenes have changed. Physical evidence has disappeared or deteriorated. And some of the most important records may have been lost. History does not always preserve the answers we want. Sometimes all that remains are fragments, a name, a letter, a witness statement, a newspaper report, a photograph, a dark alley, and a question. Who was he? The mystery of Jack the Ripper has survived because it combines history, crime, psychology, poverty, journalism, and human curiosity. It is a story about a city entering a modern age while still struggling with the problems of the past. It is a story about vulnerable people whose lives were cut short. It is a story about a police investigation that could not produce an answer. And it is a story about how a name can become more powerful than the evidence behind it. Jack the Ripper became a symbol of the unknown, a symbol of fear in the darkness, a symbol of the unsolved crime. But behind that symbol were real victims, real families, real investigators, and a real community living in fear. More than 130 years later, the streets of Whitechapel are very different. The gas lamps are gone. Horse-drawn carriages have been replaced by cars and buses. Modern buildings stand where Victorian houses once existed. People walk through the streets carrying smartphones instead of newspapers. Yet the mystery remains. Somewhere in the history of London is the answer, but perhaps we will never find it. And maybe that is why Jack the Ripper continues to fascinate people around the world. Most mysteries eventually end. A suspect is arrested. A case goes to court. Evidence is presented. A verdict is delivered. But this case has no final courtroom, no confirmed killer, no final confession, only theories, only evidence that can be interpreted in different ways, and only the names of the victims left behind. The story of Jack the Ripper therefore ends where it began, in the darkness of Victorian London. A killer walked through the streets. Women lived in fear. Police searched for answers. Newspapers created a legend. And then, suddenly, the murders stopped. The killer disappeared. The years passed. Generations came and went, but the question remained. Who was Jack the Ripper? Today, we still do not know. Perhaps he died shortly afterward. Perhaps he was arrested for another crime. Perhaps he left London. Perhaps he lived for decades without ever being identified. Or perhaps the person we call Jack the Ripper was never exactly the person history imagined. Whatever the truth may be, one fact remains undeniable. The murders changed London. They changed journalism. They influenced criminal investigation. And they created one of the world's most enduring unsolved mysteries. The name Jack the Ripper has survived for more than a century, but the people who truly deserve to be remembered are the women whose lives ended in Whitechapel. Their stories remind us that behind every mystery are human lives, and behind every historical legend is a reality that was once lived by real people. That is the final mystery of Jack the Ripper. Not simply who he was, but why, after all these years, we still remember the killer's name more easily than the names of his victims. The answer may lie not in the streets of London, but in the way human beings remember history. Some mysteries remain unsolved, some questions never receive answers, and some mysteries survive because the truth disappeared long ago. Jack the Ripper remains one of them.